got 15 minutes to throw out some challenges and opportunities. And the first thing I wanted to reflect on relates to terminology. When people ask me what I do, and more often these days what I did with my life, I kind of take a deep breath and usually talk about community development, but also community organising. I find the two terms somewhat interchangeable, and yet there's quite a debate about that terminology and how they differ and what the differences are. But I've been involved, I feel, in what I do for more than 50 years. And I started in Islington as a community worker with a small neighbourhood project, setting up playgroups, working with local mums, developing local leadership. That led inevitably into campaigning around housing, trying to stop, would you believe it, the gentrification of Barnsbury. That didn't go very well. Trying to stop the demolition of an area further up in Islington, which also did not go very well. In both cases, people were supported and helped, but that experience led to the development of the Holloway Tenant Cooperative. So I was also then involved in looking at community-led, community-owned, community-controlled services. And on the back of that, some years later, trying to take the principles that worked so well in the voluntary sector into the public sector, so local service delivery, community control, to reform public sector services, initially housing, and then on a more broader canvas at a neighbourhood level. I'm saying this partly because Mandy wanted me to sort of explain a bit about myself, but the point is, having started at a very local and very small scale, there was a logical progression, and I don't know at what point community development became community organising. The two processes seem to be kind of very much connected with one another. The thing that integrated everything was the focus on the most disadvantaged, marginalised neighbourhoods and communities. The other thing that I think is part of the picture in terms of painting a kind of kaleidoscope of relevant experience is that in the mid-1970s I was involved in establishing TELCO, the East London Communities Organisation. So I've been involved with Citizens UK for the past 20 odd years. I had my finger in lots of different camps. Many of these experiences, those examples, represent different methodologies, different approaches, different models. But they all seem to me to have the same core purpose, which is to create space for community voice to be expressed, to be heard, and to be respected in order to shift the balance of power in favour of local communities so that they can make change happen, they can drive and shape the changes that are needed. So perhaps it's important not to get too hung up on terminology. A great deal, I feel, has been accomplished over, nationally, internationally, over many years. But one of the things that I would also say is I feel quite frustrated in some ways, looking back at the pace of change, especially given the state of society today. Rampant inequality, communities left behind, the implications of Brexit and populism do really raise a question as to how effective has all of this development work, all this organising actually been? How deep, how far has it gone? Has it actually been radical enough? What's missing? And so it's timely, I think, to reflect on all the different things that we're involved in and look at whether we could be doing it better and more effectively. I will come back to this, maybe, if I've time, but I'd like to highlight two big challenges, because in 2015 I was asked to help embarking, and felt at that point that I'd gone completely full circle, because here I was back in a very poor, very deprived, very isolated community, people resentful of change that was just steamrolling over them, people sort of stuck, I think, in in a culture of complaint and expectation of others to solve their problems rather than themselves, and an area with a very long history of connections to the BNP and UKIP, so very divided and fragmented. Not an easy place to start to do really creative and ambitious and innovative community-led work, one would think. Also with the council and councillors who are very suspicious and risk-averse. My role was to try and bring all of these different groups together in order to somehow, create the foundations for an effective community initiative. And it was clear to me that what we needed was some basic, serious, fundamental, bog standard community development. Without that, it was impossible for the community to have a sense of common purpose, to work together. And we also needed to find an anchor organisation that could, act as a sort of pivotal point for them. And quite frankly, in that area, there were none. We ended up with the local high school, fortunately, a very visionary headmaster who agreed to, in a way, hold, nurture, take care of this emergent project temporarily. But it was very interesting for me that, Matt's now working full-time on it, so he'll tell you lots more about it. And it's going great guns, except that there are massive challenges. And in a way, this is one, just the amount of work that's required to create those really strong foundations. And one of the dilemmas was that the regeneration charity, which I won't name, who paid for my initial input, when I said, this is what we need, were not interested. It was too old-fashioned, too bog standard, too boring, and so, they didn't want to do it. The lottery wouldn't fund us because they wanted something that was community-led, but, chicken and egg. The local authority were completely strapped for cash, and the huge regeneration organisation that was the juggernaut that was going through the neighbourhood also said they had no resources. Of course, they had masses of resources. But also there was a question mark over whether we actually wanted them, because we were in the process of trying to find a voice for people who needed to respond to and deal with those kind of powerful organisations. So that was a real dilemma. In the end, Power to Change stepped in. Interestingly, because they recognised that there was a challenge for them in the UK with how do you deal with areas, what do they call them? Cold spots, that's right. Where do you start when there's a cold spot? And quite frankly, I suspect there are many areas many communities that are thriving and doing fantastic stuff, but there must also be many cold spots that we are not touching, left behind communities who are still to be reached. The other challenge I'd like to highlight is that this isn't community organising, community development isn't about giving communities a voice. They have a voice. It's about ensuring, finding ways, creating mechanisms, frameworks, institutions through which they can be heard and listened to and taken seriously. And so many local authorities and other institutions have adopted the language of community participation, even community empowerment. And yet there are still huge barriers. Too many local councillors still and other politicians feel threatened by other forms of community leadership, and they resist any notion of accountability other than via the ballot box. They throw up questions of legitimacy and control in ways that can create massive barriers for communities trying to move forward. Regeneration professionals, again, I am harking back to barking all the time. It sort of preoccupies me a little bit at the moment. Have a similar mistrust of community organising and a resistance to local accountability. They hide behind ideas of financial confidentiality, and there's a real lack of transparency in many of the big regeneration and investment programs. This isn't new news, it's old news, but it's almost shocking that it's still such an enormous problem, such a barrier. You know, I remember I worked in the neighbourhood renewal unit for 5 years, and we came up against it all the time then. And how long ago is that? But it's still a major problem. And so one of the challenges is, how do local communities navigate these tensions when they do want but also need to be recognised and respected? It's impossible for communities to transform an area like the area where we're working in Embarking without partnership, without support, without input and collaboration from people with power, resources, and the capacity to, you know, to make things happen. But how do you deal with those, navigate those tensions? How do you build partnership and collaborative approaches, you know, when you're up against that sort of resistance? How do you convince people who are fundamentally risk averse about the benefits of community empowerment, of co-production, and so on? I think it certainly focuses our mind in Embarking, and I think it's worth focusing it here too, because it would be lovely to come up with some answers. Sometimes, I have to say, a dramatic catalyst can make all the difference. A few weeks ago there was a fire in Barking. It was nowhere near as devastating as Grenfell. No one died, there were no serious injuries, but it was shocking. Within 3 minutes, a 6-story block was just a torch. It was just absolutely up in flames, raising huge questions. And sometimes it takes an event like that to make those in power step back and question themselves, to begin to show a degree of humility and a willingness to be open and more accountable. But it's a very, very heavy price to have to pay for recognition. I mean, yeah, that's all a bit negative, but I don't want to be all doom and gloom. So I'm going to just highlight a few opportunities and possibilities that I think we need to recognise and build on perhaps more. The Localism Act in 2001, in principle, provides a real opportunity to strengthen local institutions, devolve tangible power, resources and control to local communities, and ensure that they're involved in shaping the places where they live as real partners around the table. But as outlined in Locality's Commission on Localism, chaired by Bob Kerslake, who's actually advising Embarking, interestingly, so one would hope he would help fight our corner a little bit, we'll see. None of that is really going to get anywhere without radical action to address the sort of issues I've just mentioned above, because all those barriers and problems are still, you know, getting in the way of real progress. The other opportunity, though, is things have moved on, and we have an enormous, not just people who are, as it were, professionals in the field, but local communities increasingly have an enormous amount of experience of what this stuff looks like and feels like, and how it works and how it doesn't work. I've actually been enormously kind of excited by the response of that community I was talking about, that very marginalised, alienated community, to the opportunity to become more involved. The calibre of local people coming forward, the desire of them to really belong and make connections, you know, across a whole diverse range of groups, to make their community a friendly place where they and their families can thrive. Their anger, their palpable anger at being ignored and overlooked, combined with a sort of a willingness to collaborate, a willingness to think about solutions and to find ways forward, but not in a way where they feel manipulated and used, and where their experience and their skills and their time and effort is just, you know, drained and extracted. Okay. Their political sophistication is really heartening and exciting, and that feels really different and very exciting, because if it's true in Barking, I suspect it's true in many, many, many other places. Okay, 5 minutes. I want to I'm not going to finish. Anyway, the other opportunity I want to throw out, it's slightly random, is that over the years there have been there's been a lot of interest in various ways in tapping into international experience and what that might bring to our own kind of understanding of what's possible. And also in terms of challenging and improving and sharpening our own practice. In the early days of the Neighbourhood Renewal Unit, I was involved in piloting a number of participatory budgeting projects based on Porto Alegre. I have to say the UK experience of that was incredibly watered down and diluted, although it also, had some pretty impressive outcomes. It's still on the table, and the whole idea of, devolving budgets and having much more flexible approaches to the way in which local resources are used and spent and who controls them is still a huge issue and could make a massive difference. Another project I was involved in Luton was something called an organisational workshop, which has now been repeated in Hastings. Another really challenging and exciting model, impacting on some of the most vulnerable in society, but again needing to be adapted to a UK context because of the way in which our welfare benefit system and interface with work, the way that relationship works. And the two other things I think that are really important are Alinsky Organising in the States, which has shaped and informed Citizens UK, who see themselves certainly as the kind of pioneers of real community organising in this country. Huge amount there to be really gleaned and used and adopted, and also training for transformation developed by Anne Hope and Sally Timmel in Africa that has really provided participatory tools and experience that have been so important and have shaped a lot of what the community organising project that began originally in 2011 and is continuing has informed the way in which that programme has developed. I've had my feet in both camps for many years, and I'm not uncritical of either or both. But I've always felt that they, and I'm assuming you know what I'm talking about, sorry, but I've always felt that they represent two sides of a really effective community organising tool. Most of my working life, and certainly the sort of approach of the community organising project, has been neighbourhood based. And I think that, my first point is that is actually fundamental to the sort of foundations of effective community organising. But we also, in order to be able to exercise power effectively, whether it's just at a local authority level, but certainly if it's going to be at a regional or national level, need to be able to build alliances, build networks, and that's what Community Citizens UK has done so effectively. The challenge, I think, is that it feels there's a danger of these approaches, maybe not just these two approaches, but many other approaches, being somewhat fragmented and in competition for recognition, for resources, and that really does not feel like where we should be at this point in time. Both are important if the balance of power between people in authority and local communities is to really change. I have to say again, in Barking, we're working closely together. The project that we've established is working with community organisers to train and work with young people and provide access to the local community to the kind of training opportunities that have been developed by the programme. And we're also working with citizens to build a base that will connect into other parts of Barking. My final point, and I will stop, is that I think it's worth today coming back to the context in which we're actually operating, because it does feel to me like a very edgy and critical time. We've got Brexit with the fear of people's fear and isolation and the kind of reaction to being ignored and dismissed as unimportant, influencing, in my view, that vote. We've got obscene levels of inequality. We've got the continued threat of privatisation. Austerity allegedly is ending, but the full impact is still to be felt, and it's already had a devastating effect on the most vulnerable. We've got a massive democratic deficit, with local authorities being stripped of resources and power. And a major challenge, I think, for community organising in terms of what sort of political solutions and alternatives there might be. And we've got a huge challenge, I think, in terms of market forces. I'm thinking of housing in particular. I mentioned Barnsbury. You know, it was impossible to stop gentrification. We certainly, you know, have failed completely there. In the last few years ago, 10 years, 15 years ago, was it? Anyway, whenever, not that long ago, I was working in Woodbury Down, which is a massive former GLC estate. One of the Labour government's mixed communities pilot projects. You know, and it's now wonderful. I mean, it's being demolished, and it's allegedly mixed. But actually, the cost of housing, the way the development has been structured, has just resulted in people being squeezed out. And although in theory existing residents could return, they haven't. And you know, I think that sort of disruption is very concerning, and I think it's happening in many more places. I read something recently where some of the citizens, in fact, some London citizens' organisations were saying that one of their problems, the local institutions' problems, was the churn of people because of the housing market in London and how it was just pushing so many people out. So the scale of the challenge is really massive. I do want to say on the positive side, we've got a really interesting devolution agenda with powerful mayors that need to be put in the framework, I think. We've got examples like Frome and flat pack democracy that are beginning to sort of articulate a very different kind of way of doing politics. And of course, the community organising project and citizens increasingly has a national reach and are creating an infrastructure and a framework across the country that, you know, has huge potential that, you know, I don't think we've even begun to realise. And all of that's relevant, I think, for how we think about community organising going forward. But I do come back to my initial question as to whether, given the scale of the challenge that we're all facing, whether the way in which we approach community development and community organising is radical enough. And if it were, what would that look like going forward?